Welcome sea glass fans. It's Richard LaMotte here. I'm coming to you from the Chesapeake Bay, and we're on the eastern shore here, the Chesapeake Bay. Across the bay is where the Maryland glass was. Many years ago in the early 1900s, they were one of the main producers of cobalt blue glass, and we'll get into that later. Today we're going to talk about shard identification and what you can do to help find some of the shards in your collection and maybe to identify those and date them. Now let's start over here on the section with some colonial glass. As you can imagine, in the 1700s and early years, they would just blow up a large gather of glass and they would actually poke it to make a base. And then this would be a wine bottle. This is actually a Dutch onion wine bottle. And if you look at the lip up closely, and we can show you some of those lips, they actually have what looks like a string of glass on the lip itself. And both of these have that. There's some other shards there that have that. This is indicative of those early 1700s to mid 1700s pieces. But another way to really tell if you found a piece like that is you'll see a lot of bubbles concentrated inside the glass itself, in the core of the glass. And so that's important to look for. You can take a light or hold it up to the sun and look for those bubbles that are tightly packed in there. Now, the lips are easy to identify as some of the older ones, but the bases sometimes you can find certain characteristics that are very good for telling old bottles. This one has a very wavy front, this part to the base that is, and if you look at this and you put it down, it would almost not even sit very well. It also has a very iridescent inside kick up that's in here, very crude, very bumpy all the way around. It's not uniform, so you know it's not a modern bottle piece. And this iron oxidation is causing this iridescence in here. And that's iron that was in the actual glass itself. So here's some of those very older pieces. And then you also want to sometimes look out for different things that are parts of the bottle down near the lower part where it might actually go in. It's not flush, a straight edge. You'll find some of those indications in shards. And you'll see things like twisted parts up here, maybe bubbles that actually have twisted parts up top. Now, as the 1700s were winding down and the 1800s are coming in, the bottle lips were the first things to probably get more uniform. They are actually making them smoother, a little bit more flattened off, and you can see the clarity of the glass start to improve. And we can show you some pieces like that, but most of all, you'll see bubbles maybe just occasionally in the glass here and there and not packed in together like as tight as a sponge. Also on the lips during the early 1800s, you'll see a lot more of the tapered style lips. These are the tapered lips. This one's a double tapered lip, but it's a lot smoother, has a much more uniform bore. That's the hole inside to put a cork into. And this is typical of changes in different centuries of glass. Things got more improved, and this is a good example of a wine bottle. You can almost tell how different the crudeness is from this one to this one. So this is actually one from the early to mid 1800s. Now, one thing I was going to show you before we show you some other bottles is you will from time to time find a piece of glass, and if you do find one that's extremely flat on the bottom, you can see this sat like that, and it's very flat. Normal bottles will not have a flat base. This was most likely a drinking glass, and this one probably is from the early 1800s, but it's a drinking glass. Again, little characteristics like that can tell you a little bit about the glass that you're finding. Now, as the 1800s got rolling and the 1820s turned into 30s and 40s, there was a lot of demand for reusable bottles. This is a very hard bottle. I could drop it like I did earlier today, and it wouldn't do anything to it. It might hurt the floor more than the bottle. And you'll see some of these bottle bottoms that actually have a little bit of a twist to them on the inside. And these are very heavy, very thick black glass. Some of the 1700 glass is not that black. Actually, in the 1800s is where they have a lot of this very black glass that actually is olive green or a very deep amber color, but is very hard, and you can see the pattern inside there is actually from more of a mid-1800s style bottle. Now, during that time period, they actually started to come out in the mid-1800s with a little bit more let's say, just more beautiful bottles, is the easiest way to say it. They started making soda bottles, seltzer bottles, and beer bottles in some of these types of shapes with like little mallet shapes. And in the bottom, you might find actually what's known as a pontil scar. This is an iron pontil scar, and it has a red color to it. And then we have other ones that have open pontil scars. These are actually scars in the bottom of the bottle. This one hardly even stands up. And this is where they had a gather of glass. The glass maker would put a small gather of glass on the bottom, and he would hold on to it while the other gentleman was making the lip. And then they'd snap it off by what's called wetting off. They'd wet off the bubble, it'd snap off, and leave this pontil scar. When you find bottle bottoms with that pontil scar, just like we found this bottle bottom, you know it's pre-1860 because they stopped doing that around 1860. They were doing very crude work before that, but usually by 1860 you won't see any more of those pontil scars. So when you look at a bottle like this, which was made around that time of 1870, it has a very smooth bottom. It was in a dip mold and is a very smooth bottom, doesn't have any of those markings or very unusual characteristics. But what's nice about this bottle and this bottle you'll see is that they're called blob top sodas. These were used for soda and beer, and they have very wide, thick, tulip-shaped actual lips to them. And if you find one, it's a great find. You'll find something that's probably hasn't been around since like the 1870s, 1880s is really when these kind of went away. But these were used for a lot of beers and sodas during that time. Now, on occasion, you can find something a little bit more interesting too from the late 1800s. This is again, you have a double tapered lip here, and you'll see on it, it says Gordon's Dry Gin. I had someone a long time ago come to me and say they found what looked like a wild boar, and that's actually the logo from the Gordon's Gin. This one actually dates around 1880. Now, in that same time period, you can see they're making very thick glass pieces to kind of make bottles reusable. They wanted to keep them reusable for many, many years. And this is a very sturdy bottle that was called the Hutchinson style bottle. Very thick bottom, and you'll tell the difference, even though it has this big rounded lip up here, it's not the tulip shape like this. It's like a donut shape, flattened off. That's the Hutchinson style bottle, very popular in the 1880s. And by the late 1890s, it had been taken over by another bottle. And this was one designed by a gentleman across the bay in Baltimore, William Painter, designed the crown cork seal. Now this looks like just any other bottle these days. You can see some of these modern bottles have that same design, but what makes it unique is under the collar, there's a wavy, sloppy design under here that you can tell was hand tooled. So someone came along, hand tooled it, and this means this was made sometime between 1896 and 1905 when automated bottle machines were making everything. So you can date this as basically 1900, give or take about 5 years. Again, that's just the lip shard. If you find a lip shard that has that waviness under the collar, you're finding good stuff that was hand blown. Also at that time period, late 1800s, you'll find on occasion these little shards that have very rectangular and pinched in bottoms. We find these a good bit of the time, and these are from the drug bottles in the very late 1800s to very early 1900s, before the Pure Food and Drug Act came along and actually abolished a lot of the work that some of these people were doing, selling nostrums and things that were actually not very good for you, even though they said they healed everything. Now in the early 1900s, let's go back to some of the bottoms again. What you can see from time to time, and this might be hard to see, but you'll see some of these bottles that actually have a very small opening in it. It looks like a little dot about the size of a marble, and this one looks about the size of a poker chip. This is called a valve mark, and this is a suction scar. These were very popular, especially the valve mark on milk bottles in the early 1920s and that time, and this was 1920s and 30s, the suction scar on bottles that were the first bottles made by machines back in the early 1900s. So look for those scars when you're actually looking for your shards. Now, as around that time of the turn of the century, there's also a very large amount of these baking soda bottles made. So many of them are out there that bottle collectors call these BS bottles, but it's for baking soda, of course. But you'll find shards from that from time to time. The collar will come up, and this will be a very squared off lip, kind of a wide, kind of penny-sized opening, and those you'll find from time to time. This, on the other hand, has a longer neck. You'll see the neck difference. This is the baking soda, and this is the drug bottle neck. Now, until now, we've talked about bottle bottoms, bottle lips, and the bottoms, again, are nice and smooth, no print on this one, and this is one we'll talk about next. This is actually from 1915, pre-1915, I should say, because it has manganese in it. And actually, you see the purple color, so it was machine made. The mold line goes all the way up, and we know that by 1915, 1916, they weren't using manganese to make this color. It was made clear that would turn purple. So this was most likely made somewhere between 1905 and 1915. And again, these are some of those purple shards that you find from that glass that has manganese in it. So when you find a purple shard, a lavender shard, it's pre-1915 here in the United States. Now, a lot of folks will find these types of shards. They are from this type of ball jar you're familiar with. And you'll see it has a collar down here where the actual cap would rest on there. And you'll see a very thick edge on one side and a thread on the other. And sometimes you'll get lucky and you'll find one that has like this little half moon shape. And that was actually to control the bail when they would actually take the lightning stopper. It's called a lightning stopper. You would have a glass cap on there and you have this wire that goes up on top. And that would be the shard from that. Both of those are from the early 1920s, 30s, in that era. Now, most of you all have seen some of these before, milk and magnesia bottles. I want to point out how light blue this one is right here, because it's more of a 1920s and 1910 style bottle. It has a stopper, flattened off edge, whereas this one has the screw cap closure. These came in much more in the 1930s. So when you find something like this, you know it's more of the 1910, 1920 range, and this is 1930s. Now, we talked a little bit about Maryland glass. Some of the Bromo seltzer bottles, as well as the Vicks and Noxzema, was in a darker blue. You'll see a darker cobalt blue. So keep in mind, there is a gradation of color in these cobalt blue colors, and we can talk about that some more. So again, I'm talking about some of the bottoms of these bottles, and you'll see that there's no print until around now in the 1920s. There's some numbers on there. And of course, you've probably seen a bottle like this before, and it's the Coca-Cola bottle, and these have print on there. So after automation came in, they started to put some print on there. And then by the later 1940s and 50s, you might actually find one that has stippling. This is knurling and stippling. It's like a tire tread around the outer edge and sometimes dots on the inside. You often will find shards that have this, looks like a little tire tread on there. And those are most likely post late 1940s to 50s. By the 1950s, a lot of bottles had this tread, and that was actually designed to make the bottle manufacturing more efficient, so they'd go through into the layer faster. And also it makes it sturdier. You can make a thinner bottom by having these ridges on there. It makes it sturdier. Now back into the 1930s, there was the Pure Food and Drug Act that actually finally was abolished. And when that came out, you might find a shard sometimes that says, federal law forbids the sale or reuse of this bottle. I've seen lots of shards over the years like that. It's from a liquor bottle, somewhere between 1933 and the early 1960s. So if you find those, it's called a post-prohibition bottle shard. Now, just to kind of show you a few more of these, every once in a while, if you get lucky, you can find pieces of a telephone pole insulator. Look at some shards that are really thick, see if you have the actual lines on the inside. That would screw onto a wooden post. And these little nubs that you see coming off the bottom, those were called drip points. So these were actually designed to make the weather, make the rain and everything stay away from the wooden dowel so it wouldn't rot away and just fall to pieces. So those are drip points on some of these types of insulators. Now speaking of insulators, We have light bulb insulators. People find these from time to time. They can be either blue or purple, and they come from the inside of the bottom of a light bulb. So keep an eye out for some of those. You might find those from time to time. And then, again, starting to look at some of the differences in the color. Look at the differences in the color. This is the medium blue that we had with some of the milk and magnesia bottles, and then the darker blue is from the actual bromoseltzer bottle, Vicks and Noxzema. Now, what I'll show you also is with some of the glass that we had in front of you, again, we talked about how the yellow and the reds and also the orange were mostly from tableware. Of course, there is some darker red, the ruby red, from some of the bottles that were made, but most of the normal cherry red is actually from tableware and warning lights, whereas the yellow was almost exclusively from tableware because there's no bottles made in yellow. And the same thing for orange, almost no bottles made in orange. Now, there's another shard here that some of y'all might recognize. It's a very light yellow-green shard, very bright. If you take this into a room with a black light, light it up, and it's a piece of uranium glass, you'll know it because it glows like crazy, and that's pre-1940. So that's one way to kind of get an idea of the age of your glass. So just in closing, this little shard here with the big M on there is from Maryland Glass. And that's, again, right across the bay from us here. And we actually were able to find more of this type of glass around here because it was made so locally. Now, if you have any other questions, feel free to send them over to Kirsty at Beachcombing Magazine, and she can send them over to me sometime. But in the meantime, stay out there, keep looking, and hopefully you'll find the shard of your dreams.